Her daughter passed the turkey, then cut her off like a stranger. "Let's not start a story," Laura said. "Just eat." So Evelyn Moss, retired teacher and mother of one, ate in silence. By sunrise, Laura was erased from the will, the deed, and every account with her name on it. No confrontation, no explanation, just a forward email to the attorney. Remove her entirely now. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The platter trembled slightly in Lara's hand, not from weight but from reluctance. She handed it across the table without a glance, her manicured fingers already reaching for the next dish. Evelyn Moss caught it carefully, fingers brushing the warm ceramic, and waited for anyone, to say something. No one did. The table stretched long and elegant, dressed in soft gray linens and eucalyptus garlands that matched the color palette of Lara's Pinterest-perfect dining room. The kind of place where conversations were timed, tempered, and trimmed of anything unflattering. The kind of place where stories no longer had a seat. Evelyn smiled gently, lifting the carving fork. "This smells just like the year Laura didn't look up." "Let's not start a story," she said flatly. "Just eat." The words landed sharp and surgical. A few forks paused, then resumed scraping porcelain. No one made eye contact, not Craig, who busied himself adjusting the salt shaker, not the twins, both plugged into their earbuds, smirking at something unseen on their phones. Beneath the table, Evelyn blinked slowly. Her knife slid through the turkey breast, revealing its dry, overdone interior. She spooned a polite portion onto her plate and passed the rest along without a word. The rest of dinner unfolded like a muted play, questions directed at each other, never at her, jokes about the dog's new sweater, Cora's SAT scores, a planned ski trip to Vermont. Evelyn nodded when appropriate, smiled faintly when someone chuckled, and chewed each bite like it might be her last opportunity to remain visible. The cranberry sauce was her recipe, she knew that. But Laura hadn't mentioned it, hadn't acknowledged the handwritten card she'd left tucked into the basket she brought. It remained unopened on the counter by the sink, next to an untouched bottle of wine Evelyn had brought from home. From her seat at the end of the table, she glanced toward the mantel. Family photos stared back, Laura and Craig's wedding in Sedona, the twins as toddlers in Halloween costumes, last year's beach trip in matching windbreakers. Evelyn's absence in those frames wasn't accidental. She'd been there but not pictured, present but never captured. She tried again once later in the meal. "This stuffing reminds me of that one Thanksgiving in Tallahassee." "Remember the hurricane scare, Mom?" Laura interrupted, sharp this time. "Seriously, just eat." The silence that followed was absolute. It stretched over the clink of cutlery, the faint sound of a dishwasher cycling in the next room, the occasional chime of a phone vibrating under someone's leg. Evelyn folded her napkin in her lap slowly, methodically. She didn't cry. She didn't excuse herself. She ate her final forkful of turkey and watched her family carry on as if she were furniture. And something inside her shifted, not in rage, not even sadness. It was quieter than that, like a door closing in a long-abandoned hallway, a sudden subtle knowing this would be the last invitation and, more importantly, the last time she cared to receive one. When dessert was served, she declined. She stood to leave before coffee was brewed, murmuring polite goodbyes that no one really listened to. No hugs, no drive safe, just the soft closing of the front door behind her. The night air was crisp and unsentimental. She sat in the car for a long minute, engine off. Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket from a news alert, something about traffic, but she ignored it. Instead, she opened her contacts, scrolled to Joan Elbridge, estate attorney, and typed with slow, steady hands, "Let's begin the revision. Remove Laura entirely." She hit send, then folded her napkin with the same precision in her lap, smoothing the creases as if sealing something final. The sound of rain tapped gently on the tall windows of Elbridge, and lo, each drop steady as a metronome. Evelyn Moss sat on the other side of Joan Elbridge's mahogany desk, her back straight, coat still buttoned. She hadn't taken off her gloves. They were black leather, worn smooth at the fingertips like something ceremonial or surgical. Joan, ever composed, eyed her over the rim of square glasses. "I saw your name pop up on the calendar this morning and knew something was shifting." She gave a dry smile. "It's been, what, 3 years since you touched the will?" Evelyn said nothing at first. She just placed a thin folder on the desk and tapped it once. "I'd like to revise it effective immediately." Joan's fingers paused over her keyboard. "All right, what kind of revision?" "Remove Laura from everything." There was a silence thick enough to press against. Joan sat back slowly. "Everything?" "Just to be clear, the Asheville house, the brokerage accounts, the cabin in Pisgah, the antiques, the supplemental insurance, all of it," Evelyn said, unblinking. "And I want new beneficiaries listed, people who saw me as more than a placeholder." Joan gave a single nod, reached into the side drawer, and pulled out the necessary documents. "Any specific allocations?" "Equal split among Holly Jameson, the Asheville Women's Shelter, and the Literacy Foundation at Lincoln Middle School. I've already begun donations, but I want the estate to carry it forward." Laura receives nothing, not even a condolence check. The desk lamp's warm glow softened. "None of it," Joan said carefully. "That, with the way we'll structure this through the new trust and contestability clause, she won't be able to challenge it later, not even on emotional grounds." "I'm not interested in emotional loopholes," Evelyn said, voice firm. "She's had years of those." Joan began typing, the soft clack of keys filling the silence. Eyes filling the room like a slow march. "This change, Evelyn, once it's filed, it's irrevocable." Evelyn took off one glove, reached for the pen, and said, "Good." Joan slid over a fresh packet of documents. The language was clean, clinical, final. Evelyn read every line, then initialed in the margins, her signature gliding like she was confirming a recipe she'd known by heart for decades. She didn't hesitate, not once, when she reached the paragraph that read, "Revocation of prior beneficiary rights, Moss Laura." She paused, not out of doubt, but gravity. Then she signed and let the pen rest on top of the folder like punctuation. "I assume," Joan said as she organized the pages, "that you're not telling her?" "She'll notice," Evelyn replied, "eventually, but I'm no longer interested in her understanding." Joan slipped the final copy into an envelope marked "Client Executed Final Will and Addendum" and sealed it with a thin strip of matte tape. Then she looked up and said, almost gently, "It's done. You've vanished her from your future." Evelyn didn't announce anything. She simply stopped showing up. One invitation had come through in early December, a vague group text from Laura about Christmas Eve dinner. "Would love to see you, no mention of place or time. Just Christmas Eve's happening. Usual plan. Let me know." She didn't reply. Instead, she crossed the date off her calendar and circled it again, not for the event, but for the absence, a conscious one, the first of many. By the following week, she'd made a decision, not spoken, not posted, but deeply committed. No more performance appearances, no more folding herself small just to fit in the frame, no more offering stories that no one wanted to carry. She started canceling quietly, first the standing brunch she used to host the day after Christmas, then the New Year's call with Laura and the twins, which had devolved into background noise from their end anyway. Her phone buzzed. "Laura, are you mad about something?" Evelyn stared at the message, reread it twice, then powered off her phone and tucked it into the drawer beside her bed. Some questions didn't deserve answers. She moved next to the attic boxes labeled for the kids, sat gathering dust in the far corner beneath a plastic tree and a stack of folded card tables. She opened the first box. Inside, her mother's brooch, an embroidered tea towel from 1964, a tiny handprint in clay from Lara's kindergarten years. Evelyn didn't cry. She sorted heirlooms, donated not to Lara's children, but to places that would give them life again. The tea set went to a retirement center's common room, the lace doilies to a thrift shop run by a women's shelter. The clay handprint stayed behind, not out of sentiment, but disinterest. It no longer felt like hers. She changed the locks at the cabin. Next, the drive into Pisgah was quiet, lined with pines and the first shimmer of frost brushing the shoulders of the Blue Ridge. Evelyn drove with both hands on the wheel, heater humming low, the silence inside the car expansive and earned. The cabin stood just as she remembered, peeling paint on the porch rail, one chime tangled in last fall's leaves, the front steps needing their usual December tightening. She stepped onto the deck, turned the new brass key in her hand, and pressed it into the lock. Click. Turn. New start. Inside, dust coated the mantel where family photos once sat. She'd already removed the ones with Laura. In their place were stones from creek beds, feathers from the woods, and a single photo of Tom smiling in flannel and holding a burnt pie crust in his hands like a trophy. Evelyn knelt and started the fireplace. As the logs caught, she reached into her tote and pulled out a fresh, leather-bound journal, no title on the cover, just empty pages waiting for a different kind of story. She opened to page 1 and wrote in dark blue ink, December 17th, the first holiday I didn't pretend. Each night after that, she wrote something small, a reclaimed hour, a reclaimed thought, sometimes just didn't answer. It felt good. Replaced the wreath with silence. It looked better. Walked the woods. No one asked me to hurry. She titled it The Days I Reclaimed and tucked it into the drawer beside her bed, where her phone no longer lived. One evening, Evelyn sat at her desk and unfolded a sheet of cream stationery. She hadn't written in cursive this neatly since she'd taught handwriting in the 1980s. Her hand was slow, deliberate. The letter was addressed not to Laura but to Cora. Her granddaughter had once sat at her knee, asking questions about Evelyn's mother, about how people fell in love before phones. Cora had listened. She hadn't silenced her. So Evelyn told her the truth, not all at once, just enough. What you should know about your mother, the heading read. Beneath it, a soft but unflinching account of being made small in rooms she once built, of being smiled at and erased in the same breath. She ended the letter with one line, "You do not owe your silence to anyone who made silence the condition of love." Evelyn folded the letter, sealed it, and addressed it to Miss Cora Moss, to be opened when you start wondering. Evelyn sat at her kitchen table in the quiet hour before sunrise, steam rising from her teacup in slow, ghostly ribbons. The morning light was soft and silver, stretching through the curtains like a gentle verdict. A yellow legal pad sat in front of her, beside it, an envelope with her name embossed in gold, the most recent draft of her will. She picked up the pen. No hesitation, just ink and clarity. At the top of the new page, she wrote in sharp, deliberate script, "This is not a punishment. This is a record of being erased, of having to smile through teeth ground dull, of watching her name slip off family trees like dried leaves in the wind." She opened the envelope and flipped through the existing pages. Her handwriting was already scrolled in several places, check marks, adjustments, notes. But this revision was final, more than financial. This was narrative correction under primary beneficiary. She crossed out her daughter's name, Laura Moss, and became Holly Jameson in clean, even letters. Holly, her niece, the hospice nurse who'd once driven 3 hours to sit with her when Evelyn had the flu and Laura was out of service range. Holly, who remembered her birthday, who wrote thank you notes in her own handwriting, who never once called Evelyn too sensitive for crying during a song. That morning, Evelyn met Joan at the office again, this time with a different kind of resolve, not reaction, precision. Joan raised her eyebrows slightly as she skimmed the revisions. "All of it?" she asked. "All of it," Evelyn confirmed. "I don't want Laura to receive a key, a penny, or a phone call." Joan didn't challenge her. She reached for a thick folder and began drafting what she called a fortress trust, a no-contest clause with airtight provisions. She said, if Laura tries to interfere, she automatically disqualifies herself. We'll use a Nevada-based protective trust, high shield, low vulnerability. Not even emotional leverage can poke through. Evelyn nodded, signing each section with the slow, steady confidence of someone who had spent years shrinking herself and had finally found the volume knob again. We should also discuss funeral access, Joan said gently. Do you want contact from her then? Evelyn laughed, not cruelly but softly, the way someone laughs when they've stopped expecting fairness. No, I don't want a scene dressed up as sentiment. I want peace. Joan drafted a clause, no contact provision post-mortem, Laura Moss barred from attending any memorial, private or public, unless by express invitation of the primary beneficiary. It was both chilling and freeing. Later that week, Evelyn visited her financial advisor, Mr. Clay. He looked startled when she said the words, I want to move everything into a shielded trust excluding my daughter entirely. Not because it was strange, but because she said it with such calm certainty. I assume this is irreversible? He asked, always cautious. Yes, she said. That's why I'm here. She smiled, the kind of smile you only wear when the locks on the doors have finally been changed from the inside. When she returned home, Evelyn sat at her desk and opened a new sheet of stationery. This letter wouldn't be mailed, not now, maybe not ever, but it needed to exist. She wrote the salutation slowly, to Laura, if you dare to ask why. The letter wasn't cruel. It was clear, a detailed list not of grievances but of omissions, the birthdays missed, the stories silenced, the quiet cruelty of being asked to swallow her own voice in the name of decorum. She ended it with one line, you taught me how to disappear. I simply learned to do it better than you expected. She folded the letter, sealed it, and labeled the envelope, release only upon request. That night, Evelyn stood at the mirror brushing her hair, staring at her reflection not with regret but recognition. She silenced the story she whispered to the room, now she's written out of mine. Evelyn pulled the first photo from its sleeve with steady fingers. It was a beach snapshot, Laura at age 12, all elbows and braces, holding a melting popsicle and smiling into the sun like she didn't know what forgetting felt like yet. She stared at it for a moment, not to remember the warmth of that summer or the scent of sunscreen and salt air, but to confirm something colder. This girl had once looked at her with joy. That feeling had been real once. Now it felt like fiction. She slipped the photo out and placed it in a small, unmarked envelope, not discarded, just removed. By the end of the afternoon, Evelyn had cleared an entire album, one that used to sit on her coffee table, dog-eared and proudly shared. It was lighter now, hollow. Empty plastic sleeves shimmered where faces once lived. In their place, she inserted pieces of herself, lines of poetry she'd copied from dog-eared books, quotes she had once read to Laura before bedtime, quotes Laura had since rolled her eyes at in adulthood. One page read, "You do not become invisible all at once. It happens in the pauses between being interrupted." Another, "This space is no longer for the silent treatment." She didn't cry. She rarely did anymore. Her hands moved with quiet purpose as she flipped through the remaining albums, removing Laura from birthdays, graduations, baby showers. The twins' births were carefully preserved. Evelyn had been in those pictures too. But anything that showed Lara's adulthood began to vanish like a censored scene. She scanned a few of her late husband's photos separately and emailed them to Holly with a note, "For your records, for your memory, for someone who will care." Holly replied within hours, "Thank you. These are treasures. I miss him, and I miss how you used to light up around him." No response came from Laura, but then Evelyn hadn't sent anything to Laura, not anymore. Later that week, she reopened her journal, the one she hadn't touched since the estate revision. Its leather cover creaked open like a sigh. She flipped to a fresh page and wrote, "Emotional abuse wears pearls. It smiles at the table and calls silent civility. She remembered the last birthday Laura forgot, not just once, but 3 years in a row. At first, Evelyn made excuses. Too much work, the kids' soccer games, time zones. Then came the hollow acknowledgement. The absence wasn't an accident, it was just habit. On the fourth forgotten year, Evelyn didn't bake her own cake. She didn't light a candle. She just ate toast and wrote her name in cursive 3 times on a napkin as if to prove she still existed. At the bottom of a drawer in her roll-top desk sat a thin cream envelope, yellowed with time. Inside was Lara's wedding thank you card, the last one Evelyn had ever received. It read, "Thank you for the silverware. Hope you're well." No signature, no warmth, no hint that it had come from the same woman who once sobbed in Evelyn's arms after a high school breakup. She stared at the words for a long while, then stood, walked to the shredder, and fed the envelope. The machine hummed, chewed, and spat silence that night. Evelyn opened the draft of her obituary, something she'd begun months earlier and hadn't looked at since. Evelyn Jane Moss, age 74, retired English teacher, lover of language, collector of stories. It was short, unadorned. She scrolled to the bottom and, without flinching, added one final line, "Survived by those who listened." She saved the file, closed the laptop, and folded her hands in her lap. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like breath through a confession, quiet, steady, undeniable. The card arrived, folded in half, slipped under her door with a sprig of rosemary taped to the front. Susan's handwriting was wide, soft loops in red ink. "Join us Christmas Day." Nothing fancy, just food and people who care. Evelyn stood in the hallway, the envelope open in her hands, the smell of rosemary filling the air like memory. She almost declined out of reflex more than reason, but then she thought of the silence waiting for her if she didn't go, the kind that folded itself into her house like insulation. She called Susan that afternoon. "What can I bring?" "Your apple pie," Susan said without hesitation. "The one that ruins every other pie for the rest of the year." Evelyn smiled, more surprised than she expected to be. "You remembered." "I didn't forget." The house next door buzzed with warmth from the moment she stepped inside. Susan greeted her with a hug that lingered, not stiff or obligatory, just genuine. The living room smelled of cinnamon, roasting meat, pine needles, and melted candle wax. It was imperfect, cluttered, lived in. Evelyn exhaled. Susan's sons, Daniel and Mark, greeted her like they'd known her for years. Their wives, Jenny and Elise, bustled between the kitchen and the table in socks and mismatched earrings, laughing freely. A toddler clung to Susan's leg. No one corrected his noise. There were no name cards, no Instagram-ready place settings, just cloth napkins, a chipped gravy boat, and a real fireplace crackling in the background. At dinner, Evelyn found herself telling a story, not asking to, not waiting for permission, just beginning about the Christmas Tom had accidentally deep-fried a sock inside the turkey. Everyone leaned in. No one interrupted. Daniel nearly choked on his cider laughing. "That sounds like marriage," Elise said, wiping her eyes. "Was he always that chaotic?" "Only when he loved something," Evelyn said, smiling, and he loved that turkey like it was his third child. They played charades after dessert, a board game Evelyn hadn't touched in a decade. She pulled Mima horse and went for it, stomping and neighing until even the toddler squealed with laughter. Her cheeks ached, her eyes watered. At some point, she realized she was crying, but from joy, not grief. Jenny caught her in the kitchen later. "Your pie, unreal," she said. "Please tell me you have a recipe, or I'll be knocking on your door every December." Evelyn hesitated, then nodded toward her purse. "There's an old cookbook in there. The pages are stained, and I've written all over it, but it's yours if you want it." Jenny blinked. "You're serious?" "I am," Evelyn said, her voice steady. "You'll use it and remember where it came from." Jenny pressed the book to her chest like something sacred. "Thank you." That night, Evelyn stepped back into her home and closed the door behind her. She didn't flip on the lights. The warmth she carried from next door still clung to her coat like perfume. She sat down her purse, poured a cup of peppermint tea, and opened her journal. Her hands moved slowly but without hesitation. This is how legacy should feel. She sat in silence, letting the sentence settle. Then her phone buzzed on the end table, a voicemail. She stared at the notification. No name, just a preview of the transcript. "Lara, we noticed you weren't at church. Everything okay?" That vague, performative question hit harder than the inquiry itself. Evelyn's thumb hovered for only a second before she deleted the message. No reply, no saving it just in case. The moment dissolved into nothing, exactly where it belonged. Then she went to her settings and blocked the number, a small act, a decisive one. She sat down the phone, her breath steady, and moved to the desk in the corner. The late afternoon light stretched long across the hardwood floor. She opened her laptop, created a new email account under a quiet, generic address, and closed the tab without a second thought. No forwarding message, no digital breadcrumbs. The old account, where birthday greetings had once landed late and Lara's shopping lists had arrived without context or warmth, was gone by nightfall. In its place was air, stillness, space she hadn't realized was being occupied until it was emptied. The next day, she drove to the shelter downtown, 3 boxes of family china packed into the trunk of her car, each dish wrapped in linen. The gold-trimmed porcelain had been Lara's favorite, or at least the inheritance she always assumed was hers. The volunteer who helped unload the boxes was a young man in a knit cap and scuffed boots. He held up one plate, studied the faint shimmer along the edge. "This belonged to someone who cared," he said quietly. Evelyn smiled just enough. "It did, and now it belongs to someone else who will." She didn't linger. She didn't need to. That evening, she lit a fire and sat at the dining table with a glass of ginger tea. The air carried the faint scent of citrus peel and smoke. From a drawer, she pulled out the stationery she reserved for things that mattered, thick paper, cream-colored with slightly frayed edges. She uncapped her pen and began to write. "Holly, I didn't choose you because you're my niece. I chose you because you never asked me to be small, because you showed up when silence filled every room. You listened, not just with ears, but with effort. Legacy belongs to those who don't require a performance to recognize value." She signed it with her full name, something she hadn't done in years. Then she folded the letter, tied it with a ribbon, and placed it into a file marked personal legacy letter beside the legal documents Joan had already locked in trust. Later that week, Joan called to confirm the final stage. "It's all in place," she said. "Funded. Final. Lara is legally blocked from contesting anything, even posthumously." Evelyn nodded, phone cradled to her ear, staring out at the dusk settling over the dogwoods in her backyard. "Good," she said. No ambiguity. Joan hesitated. "Do you want to review the contact sheet for the funeral just to make sure it reflects your final wishes?" "Yes, send it over." That night, Evelyn opened the document on her laptop. A list of names, a clean column of those who would be notified. Susan, Holly, the hospice coordinator. A quiet, intentional roster. She scrolled until she found it. Moss, Lara, mobile email address still there, still assuming a seat at the table. Evelyn moved the cursor, selected the row, and hit delete. The screen asked, "Are you sure you want to permanently remove this contact?" She didn't blink. "Yes," she whispered and clicked. Evelyn sat at the old oak desk in her sunroom, afternoon light warming her hands as they hovered over the cream-colored cardstock she'd chosen. It was intentional, the kind of stationery used for graduations, weddings, and things that tried to feel formal, dignified. She wrote the salutation slowly, "Ms. Laura Moss." Then, with a poise that surprised even her, the body of the letter began, "You are cordially invited to attend the memorial service for your mother, Evelyn Jane Moss. A reception will follow, hosted at the cabin you once assumed would be yours. Pie and music provided, stories welcome. Her pen paused. A beat of quiet laughter escaped her lips, not bitter, just amused. The kind of laugh that came not from triumph but distance. She folded the letter with care, slid it into the envelope, and sealed it. Then she stood, walked to the fireplace, and lit the corner with a match. The flame caught quickly. She held it until the heat reached her fingertips, then let it fall into the waiting grate. It burned fast. Some things always do when they've been hollow for too long. She didn't watch the ash scatter. She simply turned and returned to the kitchen, where the kettle had started to hiss. A knock on the back door startled her. Holly stood there with a jar of homemade jam in one hand and a tea towel in the other. "I brought reinforcements," she said with a crooked smile. They settled in the sunroom with tea and thick slices of buttered toast. The room smelled of citrus and something like cedar, the clean kind of scent that made Evelyn think of bookstores and snow days. Holly turned her mug slowly in her hands. "You know, I used to think legacy was about children. Now I think it's about fingerprints, what you touch, what you leave behind." Evelyn tilted her head. "And what if you don't leave behind anyone to remember the fingerprints? Then you live like someone might find them anyway," Holly said, even years later. They sat in companionable quiet. Billie Holiday played softly from the corner speaker, scratchy and warm. "I never had children," Holly said eventually, "and I never wanted to, but sometimes I wonder if that means I'll just stop existing when the last person forgets me." Evelyn's voice was soft. "I raised a daughter who taught me what being invisible feels like in a room full of people." She didn't cry. Her voice didn't crack. She simply let the truth sit between them like something sacred. "I wasn't afraid of dying alone," she said. "I was afraid of dying unacknowledged, like a blinking light no one bothers to unplug." Holly reached across the table and took her hand. Her fingers were warm and firm, anchoring. "You're not alone," she said. "You were just unseen." Evelyn closed her eyes. Not to escape, but to rest. The kind of rest that only comes when the weight you've carried finally puts itself down. She smiled, not from satisfaction but from clarity, not because she'd won but because she was done needing to. When Holly left, Evelyn walked to her desk once more and opened her laptop. Her fingers moved with certainty now, no second guessing. She drafted a message to Joan. Subject: Final directive, delayed delivery. Body: Please release the letter to Laura only after my passing, only if she asks. She paused for a moment, rereading it, then added, "If she doesn't ask, don't correct her silence. Let it be the final truth she authored herself." She hit send. Outside, the wind shifted through the trees, not harsh, just enough to stir the branches, to remind her that even stillness carries sound if you listen closely enough. The next morning, Evelyn went for a routine checkup. Evelyn smiled faintly, eyes fixed on the ceiling tile above the exam table, off-white, with a hairline crack in the corner like a thin scar. "Stillness comes easier the older you get," she replied. The nurse nodded but didn't answer, just wrapped the cuff around Evelyn's arm and pressed the button. The blood pressure monitor hissed to life. Later, in the doctor's office, the news came in a practiced tone, the one they use when it's not good but not an emergency either. "Your calcium's elevated, liver enzymes too. There's some irregularity in the red cell count. It could be a cluster of things, but at your age, we take it seriously." Evelyn didn't flinch. "How seriously?" "Serious enough that I'd like you to come back for a scan. We'll order blood work, monitor over the next few months." She nodded once. No rush, just clarity. She left with a printout and a sterile smile, her purse tucked tightly beneath her arm. The parking lot outside was cold and wet. She stood by the car for a moment, face lifted toward the overcast sky, letting the grayness settle into her bones. She told no one, not even Holly. Back home, she made herself a pot of chamomile tea and sat by the window with a legal pad. The pen in her hand felt heavier than it used to. She wrote in slow, looping cursive, "Advanced directive, No resuscitation. The next morning, she called Joan and scheduled a quiet meeting. No urgency in her voice, only finality. When she arrived at the law office, she wore her navy wool coat and a brooch shaped like a feather. The receptionist offered condolences before they were needed. Joan didn't ask questions. She simply opened the file, slid the paperwork across, and watched Evelyn sign her name beside the new DNR clause. She initialed each page with methodical calm. "You're still in control," Joan said gently. "Even now." "I intend to stay that way," Evelyn replied. That evening, Evelyn sorted through fabric-soft cotton squares she'd collected over the last 5 years. Each piece represented a year Laura hadn't called for her birthday: 2018 yellow gingham from a dress Evelyn had once sewn for herself, 2019 faded blue from Tom's old work shirt, 2020 burgundy floral, a remnant from the apron she wore every Thanksgiving, 2021 plain ivory, untouched, unblemished, a year where nothing happened, 2022 dark green stitched with vines, the same fabric she'd wrapped a Christmas pie in for Susan. She pieced them together slowly, listening to the needle hum beneath her fingers. Her last quilt had no pattern, just memory arranged in color. She added no title, no initials. When it was done, she wrapped it in brown paper, tied it with twine, and wrote in pencil, "For someone who needs warmth." She mailed it to the Asheville Women's Shelter, no return address. 3 days later, the phone buzzed. A text from Joan. "Do you want to release your final directive now?" Evelyn stared at the message. The screen glowed in her palm like a question waiting to be answered, not with words, but with readiness. The conference room at Elbridge and Lowe was cold, despite the sunlit windows and polite attempts at hospitality. A tray of bottled water, untouched. A tissue box placed between 2 chairs, untouched. Laura Moss sat stiffly, her coat still on, her jaw clenched like she was bracing for turbulence that hadn't yet hit. Joan Elbridge sat across from her with a sealed envelope in hand, thick cream paper, no frills, just Evelyn's name written in deliberate black ink across the fold. Posthumous delivery requested only if Laura asked why, and she had not. With humility but with a question wrapped in irritation, she asked, "Why would she do this? Why cut me out of everything?" Joan opened the envelope and unfolded the single sheet inside. "I'm going to read it aloud," she said calmly, per Evelyn's instructions. Laura didn't protest, but her arms crossed tighter. Joan began, "Laura, you always told me my stories were too long, too much. You said I made everything about me, so I'll keep this brief, factual, like the world you preferred to live in. Fact, you stopped calling unless it was convenient. Fact, you erased me from your holiday plans before I ever left the table. In fact, you responded to my silence with nothing. Not once did you ask why it started, only why it was inconvenient. You did not forget me. You removed me carefully, strategically, one invitation at a time. I watched you hold space for everyone else, your children, your work, your in-laws. I learned where I stood by how often I had to sit quietly to be allowed in the room. This isn't a punishment. It's a record, a ledger of omissions. No inheritance is owed to someone who erased their own mother's voice." Joan folded the letter and placed it gently back on the table. The room was still. Lara's lips parted, but no words came. Her eyes were damp, but dry as she blinked them clear. She laughed once, sharp, too loud. "She's just being dramatic," she said, shaking her head. "Even now, that's what this is." No one responded. Craig, who had sat silently to her left, stared down at the polished table. His wedding ring tapped once lightly against the wood. His voice came quietly. She wasn't being dramatic. Laura turned toward him. "Excuse me." Craig met her eyes, then looked away. She just stopped asking to be seen. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was absolute. Joan stood, smoothing the letter and placing it back into the file. The envelope returned to its slot beneath the final estate documents, locked, preserved, closed. She didn't write it to change your mind, Joan said, her voice even. She wrote it so hers would be remembered. She turned the key in the drawer, the latch clicking softly, a punctuation mark. No solemn gathering, no mahogany-paneled room, no whispered tensions beneath the surface of condolences, just a beige envelope in Holly's mailbox, sealed in crisp legal plastic, delivered without fanfare by a postal worker who didn't know what it carried. She opened it at her kitchen table, alone, the sunlight slanting across her half-finished crossword and an untouched mug of tea. Inside, the full accounting of Evelyn Moss estate: house, cabin, retirement accounts, life insurance, stocks, all transferred into Holly's name with clean finality. At the bottom of the document, in Joan Elbridge's tidy font, no additional beneficiaries, no contest permitted under current law. Holly's hand hovered over the last page, her throat tightened. She hadn't expected this, not this much, not everything. She whispered to the empty room, "I didn't deserve this." She wiped her eyes, but not before the first tear hit the page. An hour later, her phone rang. Joan's voice was steady. "She made it very clear, Holly. You showed up. That was enough." Holly nodded, though no one could see her. "I just thought it would be split, or she'd leave a little something for Laura." "She left something," Joan said gently. That same afternoon, a courier dropped a much thinner envelope at Lara's front door. No ceremony, no callback request, just a plain notice inside. "Ms. Moss, this is formal notification that you are not a beneficiary of the estate of Evelyn Jane Moss. You are not entitled to property, financial disbursement, or estate representation. The terms are final and legally shielded." The letter was signed by Joan Elbridge, executive. Laura stood in her marble-tiled kitchen, eyes scanning the words twice before her hand lowered the page. She didn't cry, she didn't shout. She just stared through the bay window, watching as her neighbor watered winter pansies, completely unaware that a woman was grieving. Man had just lost a legacy she thought was guaranteed. The next morning, the Asheville house, the one Evelyn had lived in for over 30 years, went on the market. A modern real estate listing with professionally staged photos, clean hardwood floors, fresh paint, and a wide wraparound porch. Nowhere in the listing did it mention the years Evelyn had scrubbed that porch by hand or how many pies cooled on that windowsill. Laura saw the listing on her phone while scrolling at a red light. She dropped it into her lap without finishing. Craig moved out 30 days later. He didn't yell or threaten, just packed 2 duffels, left the keys in a small ceramic bowl by the door, and texted Laura, "We're both pretending too much." She didn't reply. At church the following Sunday, the head of the women's ministry approached Laura with a proposal, a small memorial plaque for Evelyn just inside the sanctuary doors. Nothing grand, just a way to honor the years she'd volunteered, donated books, and taught Sunday school. Laura declined flatly. She wouldn't have wanted that. The woman gave her a long, measured look. But maybe she earned it. Laura turned and walked away. Across town, Holly drove up the winding road to the cabin. She hadn't been back since Evelyn's passing, though the deed now bore her name. The woods around it were quiet, except for the rustle of branches and the faint sound of her own tires crunching gravel. She stepped out of the car with a single white flower in her hand, a gardenia Evelyn once said reminded her of summer dances and clean linen. Holly walked to the porch, bent down, and placed the bloom by the front step. The wood was cool beneath her fingers. The silence wasn't empty, it was earned. Holly stood at the back of the converted auditorium, watching folding chairs fill with students, teachers, and strangers who had only met Evelyn on paper. The podium at the front bore a single-framed photograph, Evelyn in her early 60s, half smiling over a stack of books, sunlight streaking across her shoulders like an afterthought. There was no grand announcement, just a simple inscription on the event program, the Moss Foundation for Literacy, dedicated to the voices no one heard. It had taken months. Holly had worked through stacks of documents, grant proposals, building permits, and legal frameworks. She poured Evelyn's life savings and a good part of her own time into the work, not to prove a point, not even to memorialize, but to build something Evelyn would have built herself had she ever believed she was allowed to. The foundation began with 3 local schools, all Title I, underfunded, often overlooked. Each received a library grant, updated reading rooms, and a full-time literacy coach. The first shipment of books arrived 2 weeks before the dedication ceremony. When the librarian at Tanglewood Elementary opened the final crate, she found not just novels, but Evelyn's handwritten notes, quotes pulled from her journal, tucked inside the front cover of every 10th book. "This one saved my voice," one note read. "Read it twice, say it out loud, let it echo." Holly had copied them herself. Every quote was pulled from Evelyn's personal journals, the same ones she had tucked away in a wooden chest inside the cabin. They were water-warped, coffee-stained, beautiful. She had them framed page by page and hung along the hallways of the Foundation's Asheville office. One entry sat at the center of the main wall. "Some people teach you how to be quiet. Others teach you why you should never stay that way." Anonymous donations trickled in. Former students, a retired librarian from Ohio who said Evelyn once helped her survive her first year teaching. A foster parent who remembered Evelyn driving across town to deliver books to a student who'd been relocated mid-semester. The messages came without names, but Holly could feel their truth through the postage stamps and fingerprints. At the cabin, she added one final touch: a bench beneath the window where Evelyn once sat to quilt, read, and watch the light change. The plaque on the bench read, "Every voice matters." It was the only sentence Holly knew for certain Evelyn would have approved without revision. When the foundation launch was covered by the Asheville Citizen-Times, the story ran under the headline, "Local Teacher's Quiet Legacy Becomes a Haven for Readers." Laura saw the article online. Her phone lit up with it during her lunch break, a shared post by a former PTA parent she hadn't spoken to in years. She clicked it once, scrolled past the headline photo, then set her phone down, screen first on the table. She didn't speak about it, not to Craig, who was no longer living at home, not to her children, not to herself. The next morning, her daughter Cora sat at the kitchen counter holding the iPad with both hands. "Did you know there's a school library named after Grandma now?" she asked. Laura didn't answer. Why didn't she ever tell us she was doing that? Cora pressed. Lara's jaw tensed. She didn't tell me either. Cora studied her a moment longer, then lowered her voice. She wrote a quote in one of the books. The principal showed it to my friend. It said, "Say it out loud, let it echo." Laura rose to refill her coffee, the silence behind her thick as fog. Back at the foundation, a student stood beside the framed quote wall, finger tracing the edge of Evelyn's handwriting beneath glass. She turned to her teacher and said quietly, "I became a writer because of her." The story broke on a Tuesday. A profile in the Asheville Citizen-Times tucked halfway down the digital front page, headlined, "From Chalk to Change, Evelyn Moss's Quiet Legacy Rewrites Local Literacy." It began with a simple sentence. She spoke softly, but her impact turned pages across a generation. By noon, it had been shared hundreds of times, reposted in alumni groups, tagged by teachers, retweeted by former students now scattered across the country. One by one, names Evelyn might have forgotten remembered her. A woman in Tallahassee wrote, "She mailed me a dictionary when I couldn't afford one." A retired Army medic from Colorado posted a photo of an old essay, corner-folded and marked in purple ink. "Find your rhythm," she wrote. "It saved me." Even her old yearbook photos resurfaced, grainy black and whites where she stood in front of a green chalkboard, hair swept back, smile crooked, eyes impossibly steady. She became a quiet icon, a reminder that not all influence demands volume. At the cabin, Holly refreshed the article once, then again. The shares kept climbing, and the comment section bloomed. That afternoon, she heard gravel crunch outside. She stepped onto the porch and saw a young man in his early 30s, tall and unsure, standing near the bench beneath the window. His jacket was threadbare, and his posture was too careful, like someone always ready to leave if needed. He held a bouquet of grocery store flowers in one hand, yellow daisies, unwrapped. Holly didn't say anything. She didn't need to. "I knew her," he said, not meeting her eyes. "I was in foster care. She was my English teacher in 9th grade. The first person who said my writing mattered." He placed the flowers gently on the bench, nodded once, then turned and walked back to his car. Holly watched him go, then sat beside the flowers for a long while, feeling the wind shift. Later, as dusk stretched across the woods, she walked back inside and reached for the wooden chest Evelyn had kept in the corner. She hadn't opened it in weeks, not since moving the journals to the foundation, but something pulled her now. Beneath the final journal, tucked between two pieces of folded muslin, she found a sealed envelope marked in Evelyn's careful handwriting. "To myself, to be read only if they remember." Holly hesitated, then opened it. Inside was a single sheet. "If they remember, it means I was never truly silent. It means the eraser didn't work. No one can steal your last word. That is the story I leave behind." The handwriting was a little shakier than the others, but the message was clear. It wasn't written for comfort, it was written as confirmation. That night, Holly took out a fresh journal, cloth-bound with a navy spine and blank pages. She opened to the first page and dated it, "Day 1 for Evelyn." She wrote in silence, the fire crackling in the hearth beside her, the window behind her lit faintly by the porch lamp, and the memory of footsteps now gone. It was the same table, long and glossy, flanked by cream-upholstered chairs, and a perfectly folded linen runner Lara had ironed twice. The same crystal glasses, the same untouched silver candlesticks from her wedding registry. But this year, one chair sat conspicuously empty, Evelyn's chair. It had always been placed second from the head, just left of Craig, facing the window with the best view of the garden. Even last year, even after everything, Evelyn had occupied it without drama, just presence. Now it stood silent, stiff-backed, unclaimed. Lara moved around it all morning, never acknowledging it, never daring to remove it either. When the guests began arriving, siblings-in-law, the neighbors with the new baby, her daughter Cora's friend from college, the table looked full. Still, every guest's eyes drifted once, then twice, to the empty place setting, as if the vacancy hummed. No one asked until Craig did. He lifted a fork full of sweet potato casserole and said gently, "Your mom would have loved this one. You used her brown sugar trick, didn't you?" Lara didn't look up. "It's a common recipe." A beat of quiet followed, awkward and uneven. The scrape of cutlery resumed, and the meal continued with artificial cheer. The roasted carrots were overdone, the cranberry sauce came from a can, and the playlist Lara had curated, smooth jazz and acoustic covers, failed to cover the tension pulling in corners. After dessert, the younger guests drifted to the living room. Cora lingered at the table, turning her spoon in an empty bowl. Her voice came softly, "Why don't we see Grandma anymore?" Lara stiffened. She moved away to somewhere quieter. Cora frowned. "She didn't tell us." "She didn't have to," the answer snapped like a dish towel. Lara stood and began clearing plates, conversation closed. But 2 days later, Cora sat at the public library, scrolling through an article for her American Lit elective when something strange caught her eye on the bulletin board beside the printer. A flyer. Moss Foundation. Literacy drives change. Below it, a photo of her grandmother framed in soft light, standing in front of a bookshelf, mid-laugh. Cora stared. She pulled out her phone, snapped a picture, and later that night, sitting cross-legged on her bed, she zoomed in and read every word, named in honor of local educator Evelyn Moss. The foundation supports reading programs across 3 counties with a special focus on underserved schools. The next morning at breakfast, Cora set her phone on the kitchen table. "Mom," she said, "why did Grandma make a school in her name but not tell us?" Laura looked up slowly, her hand paused mid-pour over a half-full mug of coffee. She opened her mouth, but no words came. The air shifted. Cora didn't press. Not yet. She just waited. The truth stood in the silence, fully dressed, waiting to be seated. The cabin smelled like cinnamon, clove, and rosemary, a mix of pie and something older, more grounded, like wood soaked in decades of winters. Holly stood at the stove, stirring gravy with one hand and humming softly to the jazz crackling through the vintage record player, Miles Davis, Evelyn's favorite. Outside, snow flirted with the trees but didn't settle. Inside, the house pulsed with quiet warmth. The table was small, just 6 chairs, but each one was filled with someone who had listened, who had stayed. There was Daniel and Elise, Susan's youngest son and his wife, holding hands under the table. Across from them, Holly's coworker from the Literacy Foundation, whose own mother had passed the year before, and Cora, yes, Evelyn's granddaughter. Seated next to Holly, knees tucked, eyes wide. She had asked to come quietly weeks earlier, not through Laura on her own. Now she passed the stuffing. A soft smile. "This is amazing. Did you use Evelyn's recipe?" Holly nodded. "I didn't dare change a thing." No one rushed, no one scrolled through phones or talked over the jazz. The room held its own rhythm, the kind that allowed for silence without discomfort, the kind Evelyn had tried to protect once in a house where no one listened. After dessert, 2 pies, one slightly burnt, Holly stood and cleared her throat. "I have something," she said, unfolding a small piece of yellowed paper from her pocket. The room fell still. "It's a poem I found tucked inside Evelyn's last journal," she said. "Untitled, but I've been calling it Last Word." Her voice didn't shake. "They thought I vanished quietly, but I did not leave. I unspooled myself across the walls, the shelves, the hands that turned each page. You cannot erase what you never understood. Silence is not absence, it is architecture, and I have built a house inside every ear that listened." When she finished, no one moved. The wind outside curled against the windows, not cold, more like breath. Inside, the fireplace snapped once, a log shifting in the hearth like punctuation. Elise raised her glass first to Evelyn. "To those who were unheard but unforgettable," she said. They echoed the words together, soft and strong. "To those who were unheard but unforgettable." Ka wiped her cheek and smiled. "She really was the best storyteller. I just didn't get to hear enough of them." "She left them behind," Holly said, tapping the journal that now sat open on the side table. "She always knew they might need to be found, not told." They lingered at the table longer than planned. Holly didn't clear the plates right away. She didn't rush to load the dishwasher or reset the room. Instead, she let the stories circle. Susan's sons telling old neighborhood tales, Cora sharing a poem she'd written last week, Daniel describing his daughter's new love for reading. No one said, "Just eat." When the guests left, trailing hugs and coats and half-empty pie tins, Holly remained at the window for a while, watching the taillights disappear into the woods. Snow had finally started to fall, real snow, quiet and slow. She returned to the table. A single candle still flickered near Evelyn's empty chair. Holly didn't extinguish it. Instead, she let it burn, the wax curling down the side, slow as breath. The wind stirred once through the cabin's old curtains, brushing them outward like hands reaching from memory. It didn't rattle the windows, it didn't creak the door. It simply moved, soft but strong.